One of the little details that I've been rather brushing over so far in our look at Entity Framework Core is the issue of configuration. So that's to say how we specify both what type of database we want to use fundamentally, so whether it's SQL Server or Oracle or something like that, and then additionally, within one type of database, what the connection is going to be, so where the database is going to be stored, that sort of thing. And so those are all issues of configuration. And if we look at the program that I've been working through as it stands, remember we've got our book library, which is where we have our couple of entities, author and book, and then we also have the book's context, which is our connection point to the database. And then I had a couple of other projects. We have a website that makes use of this book's context and just a console application that does a similar sort of thing. And if you remember how we left this previously, this is how we went about doing the configuration. So I used this thing called the DB Context Options Builder, which was instantiated for my context. I specify I'm going to use SQLite, so that's the type of database. And then also we've got the connection string, which is going to be a completely different format from one database to another, but that's what it looks like for SQLite. And we can see it's just specifying that local library. And then we pass that into the constructor for our books context, and that's picked up in this constructor here and then just passed down to the base class. And in the end, that produced for us this mylocallibrary.db that we're looking at there. Now, the big problem we've got here is really the fact that this bit of code is something that's going to vary quite a lot. At the very minimum, it's going to vary because when we're doing development, we probably want to connect to some kind of local database that we as developers are just using, whereas when it's in production, there will be a production database. And of course, if you've got multiple sites, there may be multiple production databases. So that's where that needs to vary. Even the type of database itself may well vary, although once we've settled on SQL Server or SQLite, that's probably fairly stable. When we're doing unit testing, we're going to want to switch that for an in-memory database, as we've talked about in other videos. So those are the two things we might want to change. Now, one thing we can do, and you will see done, is we can actually do something like this. We could go into our books context and override a method from the DB context base class, which is called OnConfiguring. And that is called automatically during the startup process for the DB context. It takes in this thing called an options builder, which we will be familiar with because that's what we had over there. And then it allows us to do the configuration. And so all we need to do would be to grab that code there, and then in here, just make the same call, and that will do the work for us. So if we go back to our program, and if we get rid of that option, so we will be using just the default constructor, and then make sure this is our startup project. And we can see if we put a break on there, we hit the breakpoint. If we look at the call stack, we can see that's happening essentially the first time we made any use of the database whatsoever, in this case, ensure created. And then if we carry that on, we can see we're getting those books that we already had in the database previously. But I have to say, although that's an option, I think it is a really poor one, because what it's now done is link together the book's context with the database to which that is going to connect. And that has cut out our flexibility. Obviously, we could still put code in here that read the file name out of a config file or something like that. It's not impossible, but it just seems to breach one of our key principles. That's to say the single responsibility principle. This book's context now, as well as being responsible for the entity framework side of things, has also become responsible for managing the connection as well. And we'd rather split that up. So in fact, what we started out with was at least better in that it was the main program that made these decisions rather than the book's context internally. And we can see that happens either in there or in our website. That's similar sort of thing happening there in the startup. So what we need to do is get that information, the connection string, into some kind of config file so that it can be changed without us having to rebuild the application. It can be changed even by a system administrator. It shouldn't really be the job of a developer. And when we're doing this in the web version, that's actually pretty much handled for us because the config file is pre-declared. It's appsettings.json. And if we look in there, it doesn't actually have what we want in there yet, but all we need to do is put a section in here called connection strings, and that name, connection strings, you've got to get exactly right. Most of this you choose for yourself, but that one is going to be looked up automatically. You could in here directly put your connection strings, but if we're going to have the idea of switching between different connections, I like to do it as a slightly more structured approach. So I would put in here books library and then have subsections in there where I could name my different types of databases. So if we're going to start out with SQLite, I can just call that SQLite, and then in there I can just provide the connection string, which is going to be what we had in the startup. So I will pinch all of that and just pop that in there, and so that's what we've got, and then just need a comma on the end there. And then in our startup, rather than doing the hard-coded use SQLite, we can just use this configuration property that's been provided for us. So I'll get rid of that literal string, and then I'll say configuration dot get connection string. And so that's why we had to be careful that we called this precisely connection strings, because that method is specifically going to look up in here. But then inside that, as I say, we could have just asked for the name directly, but because I put this in a subsection, we need to ask for books library, and then the separator, just like in the JSON file, is a colon. So books library colon SQLite. And so now it's just going to be reading exactly the same string, but it's getting it from the config file rather than having it hard-coded into the program. But it should still work when we run that up. We can see we're getting the books out of the database. In the web application, all of that code for the configuration was generated for us for free when we opened the MVC core application template. And so we only had to do that tiny bit of actually putting the data in the config file and then reading it out for the use SQLite. But when it comes to a console application, we've got to do much more work for ourselves. So if we switch back to our console here, then in our program, we've actually got to do a little bit of work. What we have to do is we have to declare for ourselves a configuration object. So we use the interface iConfiguration, and we'll just call that config. And then we say equals new configuration builder. And then at this point, we can select the type of configuration that we want. And in .NET Core, we have got a vast selection to choose from. We can go for XML files. We can go for INI files, if you remember those that we used to have in Windows 95 and things like that. We can go for a JSON file, which is what we had by default in the web application, and several others as well. And I'm just going to go for that JSON file because that's the one that in most cases I think is the easiest to use. And so we need to go, as ever, to NuGet and add something in for that. So in here, let's add a NuGet package. And if we just do a search for configuration.json, then we can see that's the package that we want. So we'll install that. And then back in the code, if we now on here say dot, and you can see we've now got a couple of additional possibilities, doing it from a JSON file or a JSON stream. I'm going to do this from a JSON file. So I say add JSON file, and then I simply need to specify the name of the JSON file. So I could go for anything, but why be different? We're just going to have an appsettings.json. I can add some other ones as well if I wanted multiple configurations, but let's keep it simple on that. And then I can just say dot and then build. So we've created this configuration builder. we've configured it, and then the build is what returns our actual config. And then that config, you'll notice, is actually the same thing that we had here in the web application, an object of type iConfiguration. So we can see where we're going with this. All I now need to do is here, where we're building up the options, change that to config.getConnectionString. And then I'm going to structure this in exactly the same way, so I might as well copy the code. So let's just copy books library SQLite. And that should work in the same sort of way. So all we've now got to do is actually have this app settings.json. So if I go to my project, add, and then a new item, and then let's go for JSON file and call this app settings. And then to save a bit of time, let's just steal that from the website version. And then I will need one more close curly. And also, thing to bear in mind, it's a slightly different location here because of the file structure for a console application. So we need to put it in there like that. One other thing we need to remember to do on this app settings.json, if we go to its properties, is we've got to do a copy, and I'll just go for copy if newer. So the app settings.json we have created in our source code folder, but it needs to actually be deployed along with the executable. So that copy if newer means it'll be deployed, but only if we ever make any changes to it. So that's what we've got there. And that should now mean, if we run this one up, that it's found the database and we've got those listed out. So not very much that we had to do there, but it was a little bit more than we had to do with the web application, simply because actually if you go to the program for the web application, in this create default builder, somewhere deep down in there, it actually does that configuration for you. If you wanted in a web application to have something slightly different, like using an XML file or something like that rather than the app settings.json, or even have a JSON file of a different name, you'd have to start writing some similar code in there. That's why, for the most part, we just leave it as the default. But in our console application, we had to do that for ourselves. Obviously, we're still tied into the fact that we are using SQLite. If we wanted to make even that configurable, then all we would do is put an if statement or something like that in there. So we could have a look in our config file. If we had an SQLite connection string defined, then we could do options with SQLite. If we had a SQL Server one, we could do a SQL Server. So you just have to put a switch or an if or something like that. So there we've seen it. Fairly simple stuff we can do. One approach was to override that method inside the DB context, but personally I really don't like that because it ties together too many things in the DB context. We saw that doing it this way, by creating an options object and passing that into the DB context constructor, that's the better way to go. And then we saw that how do we get hold of those options? Well, we do it for the connection string through the iConfiguration interface, and we saw how we just do that pretty much automatically in a website, whereas in a console application or other types of application, we have to do a bit of coding for ourselves. But I hope that was helpful. Next time, we're going to be looking at some more features. We're going to be looking at the idea of code-first migration entity framework. So do subscribe and make sure you don't miss that.